The diplomatic loophole. The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been in continuous deliberation for 72 hours. In the Grand Chamber of the Unity Station, representatives from 47 civilizations sat in their designated pods, each one floating in a carefully controlled atmosphere suited to their biology. The holographic displays at the center showed images that made even the most hardened diplomats uncomfortable. Burning fields on Kelthera. Displaced families huddled in makeshift camps. Vordaxian soldiers standing over civilians with plasma rifles raised. Ambassador Chen Wei sat in Earth's delegation pod, her fingers drumming against the armrest. She had watched this performance before. The council members would express concern, debate endlessly, and ultimately do nothing. The Non-Interference Treaty of 2847 bound them all. No military intervention in the sovereign affairs of member states. No deployment of armed forces without unanimous council approval. It was a law designed to prevent galactic war, but it had become a shield for tyrants. The situation on Kelthera is regrettable, High Arbiter Telmon was saying, his crystalline form refracting light across the chamber. However, the Vordaxian Empire maintains that this is an internal security matter. They claim rebel elements threaten stability. Chen leaned forward, activating her microphone. Rebel elements? High Arbiter, the images speak for themselves. Farmers are being forced from their land. Children are working in processing facilities. This is not security. This is systematic oppression. Ambassador Kryll of the Vordaxian delegation rose to his full 8 feet, his scaled hide rippling with indignation. The human speaks from ignorance. Kelthera welcomed our administrative presence. We brought order to chaos, infrastructure to primitives. If some resist progress, that is unfortunate but necessary. Welcomed. Chen's voice carried an edge that made several delegates turn. The Keltheran representative to this council disappeared 3 months ago. Her replacement was appointed by your government. That is not welcome. That is conquest. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of translated voices. Some supported Chen's assessment. Others cautioned against interfering in complex cultural matters. Most simply wanted the problem to disappear so they could return to more comfortable topics. High Arbiter Telmon raised his primary appendage, and silence gradually returned. Ambassador Chen, we understand Earth's position. Your species has a documented history of championing the oppressed. However, the treaty is clear. Without evidence of genocide or weapons of mass destruction, we cannot authorize military action. The Vordaxians maintain legal occupation status under colonial administration protocols. Chen sat back, frustration burning in her chest. She had presented evidence, testimonies, documented violations of dozens of galactic conventions. None of it mattered. The other civilizations were too comfortable, too afraid of setting precedents, too invested in maintaining their precious order. The session adjourned with the standard result, a strongly worded condemnation and a request for the Vordaxians to exercise restraint. Chen gathered her materials, nodding curtly to fellow delegates as she exited. In the corridor outside, she was joined by her assistant, David Park, a young diplomat with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. That went well, David said dryly. They are cowards, Chen replied, not bothering to lower her voice. Every one of them knows what is happening on Kelthera, and they hide behind legal language. So what do we do? Chen stopped walking, turning to face him. We find another way. There is always another way. That night, while most of Unity Station slept in whatever way their biology required, Chen sat in her private quarters surrounded by holographic displays. She had pulled up the full text of the Non-Interference Treaty, all 4,000 pages of it in 17 languages. She had read it before, of course, but never with this level of desperate focus. The treaty prohibited military intervention. It prohibited the deployment of armed forces. It prohibited military advisors, weapons shipments, tactical support, and covert operations. The document was thorough, written by beings who had experienced the horror of galactic-scale warfare and were determined to prevent its recurrence. But as Chen read deeper, moving past the primary articles into the subclauses and amendments, she began to notice what the treaty did not prohibit. It said nothing about civilian travel. Nothing about cultural exchange programs. Nothing about tourism or humanitarian workers or educational initiatives. Her hands moved quickly across the interface, pulling up related documents. The Freedom of Movement Act guaranteed all galactic citizens the right to travel to any member world that maintained open borders. Kelthera, despite the Vordaxian occupation, technically still had open borders. The Vordaxians had never formally closed them because doing so would require council approval and international oversight. Chen felt her pulse quicken. There was a gap in the law, a space between military action and complete inaction. If they could not send soldiers, they could send something else. Something the treaty never anticipated because no civilization had ever been crazy enough to try it. She opened a secure channel to Earth. The holographic figure of Director Maria Santos materialized before her. Maria was the head of the Civilian Action Network, a non-governmental organization that coordinated humanitarian responses across human space. She was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that had seen too many crisis zones. "Chen, it is 3 a.m. here," Maria said, but her tone was alert, not annoyed. "I need to ask you something unusual," Chen began. "How quickly could you mobilize 10,000 civilians for an extended cultural exchange program?" Maria's eyebrows rose. "That depends entirely on where they are going and what they will actually be doing." Kelthera. "And they will be tourists." There was a long pause. Maria leaned forward, and Chen could see the moment understanding dawned. "You want to flood an occupied world with human civilians. The treaty prohibits military intervention. It says nothing about tourism. If 10,000 humans decide they want to visit Kelthera, experience the culture, learn about agricultural techniques, volunteer with local communities, who can stop them? The Vordaxians cannot close the borders without council oversight. They cannot restrict civilian movement without violating a dozen other conventions." Maria was quiet for a moment, thinking through the implications. "It would be dangerous. The Vordaxians will not welcome interference, legal or not." "I know. That is why I am asking if it is possible, not if it is safe." A smile spread across Maria's face, the kind of smile that came from recognizing a particularly elegant solution to an impossible problem. "Give me 2 weeks. I will get you your tourists." The recruitment began quietly. The Civilian Action Network put out calls through its extensive volunteer database. Teachers, engineers, medics, farmers, artists, retired military personnel, students on gap years, anyone with skills that could be useful and the courage to use them in uncertain circumstances. The official description called it a cultural exchange initiative, an opportunity to experience life on a pastoral world and contribute to community development projects. The unofficial briefings were more honest. Volunteers were told they would be going to an occupied world where the local population faced systematic oppression. They would not be carrying weapons. They would not be operating under military command. They would simply be present, visible, and inconvenient. Their job was to bear witness, to document, to teach, to help, and to make it impossible for the Vordaxians to operate in the shadows. Marcus Cole was among the first to volunteer. He was a structural engineer from New Lagos, 43 years old with strong hands and a patient demeanor. He had spent 20 years building infrastructure in conflict zones across human space. When he read the recruitment notice, he understood immediately what was being asked. "You want us to be human obstacles," he said during his interview with a coordinator. "That is one way to phrase it," the coordinator replied. "You will be teaching Keltherans about engineering techniques, helping them maintain their equipment, sharing knowledge. If that knowledge happens to help them work more slowly or less efficiently than the Vordaxians prefer, well, that is simply an unfortunate cultural difference." Marcus grinned. "When do we leave?" Amara Johnson signed up 3 days later. She was a teacher from the London Education Collective, 32 years old with a passion for literacy programs and a stubborn refusal to accept injustice. She had taught in refugee camps, in post-war zones, in places where books were luxuries and education was resistance. "I can teach reading," she told her interviewer. "I can teach history, mathematics, critical thinking. I can help people understand their rights under galactic law. The Vordaxians will not like that." Good. I do not like them either. The volunteers came from every corner of human civilization. There was James Chen, a retired Marine who insisted he just wanted to see new worlds in his old age. There was Sophia Reyes, a documentary filmmaker who brought enough recording equipment to capture every moment. There was old Thomas Wright, a farmer who had worked the soil for 70 years and wanted to share what he knew with the Keltheran agricultural communities. They trained together in a facility outside Geneva. The training was not military, but it was thorough. They learned about Keltheran culture, language basics, local customs, and legal rights. They learned how to document evidence, how to operate in hostile environments without escalating to violence, how to protect themselves and others through presence and awareness rather than force. Director Santos addressed them on the final day before departure. They gathered in a large hall, 10,000 faces representing the diversity of humanity. Young and old, from 100 different cultures and backgrounds, united by the decision to step into danger for people they had never met. "You are not soldiers," Maria told them. "You carry no weapons. You operate under no military authority. You are civilians exercising your legal right to travel and engage in cultural exchange. But make no mistake, what you are about to do is a form of combat. You will be fighting with cameras instead of guns, with teaching instead of tactics, with simple human presence instead of military force." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembly. "The Vordaxians believe they can do whatever they wish on Kelthera because no one is watching. You are going to prove them wrong. You will watch. You will record. You will help. You will stand beside the Keltherans in their fields and their homes and their streets. And when the Vordaxians try to hurt people, you will make sure the entire galaxy sees it. This will not be easy. Some of you may be arrested. Some may be injured. The Vordaxians will try to intimidate you, to push you into doing something that breaks the law so they can have you removed. Do not give them that satisfaction. Stay calm. Stay legal. Stay visible. Let them be the ones who lose control." The transport ships departed from lunar orbit on a Tuesday morning. 10,000 civilians in 20 vessels, flying under commercial registry with proper documentation and filed flight plans. Ambassador Chen watched them go from Unity Station, where she had just delivered formal notification to the Galactic Council of Earth's new cultural exchange initiative with Kelthera. The Vordaxian delegation had erupted in protest. Ambassador Kryll accused Earth of circumventing the spirit of the treaty, of using civilians as military proxies, of interfering in sovereign territory. Chen had listened patiently, then responded with carefully chosen words. "The non-interference treaty prohibits military action. We are not sending military forces. We are exercising our citizens' right to travel and engage in cultural exchange as guaranteed under the Freedom of Movement Act. If the Vordaxian Empire wishes to restrict this, they may petition the Council for authorization to close Kelthera's borders. Of course, such a petition would require full disclosure of conditions on the planet and international monitoring of the closure. We await your decision." Kryll had not filed the petition. As Chen expected, the Vordaxians preferred the occupation to remain as invisible as possible. Closing the borders would draw exactly the kind of attention they wanted to avoid. The transport ships entered Keltheran space 12 days later. The planet appeared on their view screens, a beautiful world of green continents and blue oceans, scarred by the geometric precision of Vordaxian industrial complexes. In orbit above, military vessels immediately moved to intercept. Commander Zethric, head of Vordaxian security forces on Kelthera, stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the approaching transports with growing irritation. 20 civilian vessels, all properly registered, all transmitting standard identification codes, all completely legal and completely unwelcome. What are they doing here? His second officer asked. Tourism, Zethric replied, his voice heavy with contempt. The humans think they can interfere without sending their military. They send civilians instead, as if that makes any difference. Should we turn them back? Zethric considered the option. He could deny them landing permission, but on what grounds? They had broken no laws. They posed no military threat. Forcing them away would require justification to the Galactic Council, and his superiors had been very clear about avoiding council attention. Let them land, he decided. They are soft creatures playing at resistance. When they see how uncomfortable and dangerous it is here, they will leave on their own. A few weeks at most. The first transport touched down at the primary spaceport in Kelthra's capital city. The landing ramp descended, and humans began to emerge. They carried luggage and cameras and expressions of excited curiosity. They looked around at the Vordaxian guards with weapons and the fearful Kelthran workers and the industrial sprawl that had consumed what had once been beautiful architecture. Marcus Cole was among the first down the ramp. He breathed the air of Kelthra, tasted the faint bitterness of industrial pollution mixed with native flowers, and smiled. Well, he said to the woman beside him, we are here. Time to be the most inconvenient tourists these people have ever seen. Behind them, 9,999 more humans descended, ready to prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply refusing to look away. The Quiet Revolution. The Vordaxian checkpoint at the spaceport was designed to intimidate. Armored guards stood at regular intervals, their plasma rifles held in ready positions. Biometric scanners probed every arriving visitor with invasive thoroughness. The walls displayed screens showing security footage and stern warnings in multiple languages about restricted areas and prohibited activities. The humans moved through it with determined cheerfulness. They smiled at the guards. They took pictures of the architecture. They asked questions about everything. Where could they exchange currency? Which areas were best for experiencing local culture? Were there markets nearby? Could they sample traditional Kelthran cuisine? The guards, trained to handle resistance with force, had no protocol for handling politeness with enthusiasm. They processed the humans with growing confusion, stamping travel documents and assigning temporary residence permits because nothing in their regulations allowed them to refuse entry to properly documented civilians. Marcus Cole found himself assigned to a residential district on the edge of the capital, an area where Kelthran workers lived in cramped housing blocks near the processing facilities. He arrived with a group of 30 other humans, all carrying minimal luggage and maximum curiosity. They were greeted by nervous Kelthran neighbors who had learned that showing too much interest in anything could bring unwanted attention. The Kelthrans were humanoid in general form but distinctly alien in detail. Their skin had a faint blue-green tint, adapting to their sun's particular spectrum. Their eyes were large and expressive, evolved for a world with longer days and gentler light. They moved with a fluid grace that came from generations of working the land, bodies shaped by agricultural rhythms rather than industrial demands. Marcus introduced himself to the family in the adjacent housing unit. They were the Thelm clan, 3 generations living in a space that would have been cramped for one family on Earth. The grandmother, Mira Thelm, watched Marcus with wary eyes that had seen too many promises broken. You are from Earth, she said in heavily accented but understandable Galactic common. I am, Marcus replied. I am an engineer. I wanted to learn about your world, about how you build and create things here. There is little to learn. We work in the factories. We meet quotas. That is our life now. Marcus set down his bag and squatted to bring himself to eye level with Myra's young grandson, a child of perhaps 6 years who peeked out from behind his grandmother's legs. What is your name? Kelm, the boy whispered. Kelm, that is a strong name. Do you go to school? The boy looked to his grandmother, uncertain. Myra's expression hardened. The children work. The Vordaxians say education is provided at the facilities. They learn to operate machines. Marcus felt anger coil in his chest, but he kept his voice gentle. I see. Well, I know many things about machines. Perhaps I could teach some of the children in the evenings. Not to replace their work, but just for fun. To understand how things are built, how they can be fixed, how they might be improved. Mira studied him for a long moment. Why would you do this? Because knowledge is valuable. And because children should have the chance to learn more than just how to meet quotas. Across the capital, similar conversations were happening in dozens of districts. Amara Johnson had been assigned to a sector near what had once been Kelthra's primary educational complex, now converted into administrative offices for Vordaxian bureaucrats. She walked the streets with a tablet in hand, documenting everything. The empty school buildings. The children who should have been studying but instead hauled materials. The parents who worked double shifts and came home too exhausted to do more than sleep. She found a small park, one of the few green spaces the Vordaxians had not yet paved over, and sat on a bench. Within minutes, curious Kelthran children began to approach. They had learned to be cautious around adults, but there was something different about this stranger with her strange appearance and stranger technology. Hello, Amara said, holding up her tablet. Would you like to see something amazing? The children edged closer. Amara activated a program she had prepared, a simple interactive story that displayed in holographic projection above the tablet. It showed a Kelthran child much like themselves going on an adventure, solving problems with cleverness and courage, learning about the stars and the worlds beyond their own. The children watched with wide eyes. One brave girl, no more than 8 years old, reached out to touch the hologram. Her fingers passed through the light, and she laughed, a sound that seemed startled to emerge from her own throat. Would you like to learn how to make stories like this? Amara asked. The girl nodded eagerly. Others pressed closer. Within an hour, Amara had 20 children gathered around her, all learning basic programming concepts disguised as storytelling tools. She taught them how to input commands, how to create characters, how to make choices that affected outcomes. She also taught them to ask questions. Why does this happen? What would happen if we changed this? How else could we solve this problem? Questions that, once learned in the context of stories, could be applied to any situation. Commander Zethric received the first reports of human activities within 3 days. His officers described humans teaching children, humans repairing equipment in ways that somehow made it less efficient, humans gathering in groups to sing and share food with Kelthran neighbors. None of it was illegal. All of it was irritating. They are disrupting productivity, one officer reported. The workers in Sector 7 have been arriving late to their shifts. They claim they were attending educational sessions. Educational sessions are not prohibited, Zethric replied, though his voice carried frustration. Have they broken any laws? Entered restricted areas? Engaged in political organization? No, Commander. They are simply present. And the Kelthrans respond to their presence. Workers ask more questions now. They request repairs to equipment. They reference their rights under labor conventions. Zethric's claws tapped against his command console. He had dealt with resistance before. Rebels who attacked facilities, who organized strikes, who raised weapons. Those he could suppress with force. But what did one do with teachers who violated no laws? With engineers who helped too enthusiastically? With artists who gathered crowds simply by playing music? He decided to make an example. Not of the humans directly, but of the Kelthrans who associated with them too openly. If the locals learned that befriending humans brought consequences, the problem would solve itself. In Sector 12, a Kelthran worker named Dren Voth had been particularly enthusiastic about the human presence. He had invited them to his home, introduced them to his extended family, helped translate conversations between humans and Kelthrans who spoke no common. He was arrested on his way to work, charged with unauthorized assembly and potential conspiracy. The arrest happened at dawn. Vordaxian security forces surrounded Dren's housing block, their weapons visible and threatening. They dragged him from his home while his family screamed protests. Neighbors watched from windows, terrified and helpless. But this time, the arrest did not happen in private. Sofia Reyes, the documentary filmmaker, lived 3 doors down. She had her camera running within seconds of the first shouts. She captured everything: the excessive force, the crying children, the way Dren was thrown into the transport vehicle despite offering no resistance. She also captured the moment when Marcus Cole stepped into the street. He did not try to physically intervene. He simply stood there, camera in his own hand, recording. Then James Chen, the retired Marine, emerged from another building. Then Amara Johnson. Then more humans, until there were dozens of them lining the street, all recording, all bearing witness. The Vordaxian officer in charge hesitated. He could arrest the humans as well, but on what grounds? They stood on public streets. They made no threatening moves. They simply watched and recorded. To arrest them would be to admit that watching was dangerous, that the Vordaxians had something to hide. The transport left with Dren Voth, but it left with an audience. Within hours, Sophia's footage was transmitted off-world. The Civilian Action Network distributed it across human networks. Independent journalists picked it up. By evening, citizens on 40 different worlds had watched a Keltheran father dragged from his home for the crime of being friendly to visitors. Ambassador Chen presented the footage to the Galactic Council the next morning. "This is what happens on Kelthera," she said, her voice measured but forceful. "A civilian arrested for having conversations. This is the stability the Vordaxians claim to maintain." Ambassador Kryll objected immediately. That individual was engaged in conspiracy. He was organizing resistance activities. Was he? Where is the evidence? Where is the trial? Under galactic law, even in occupied territories, civilians have the right to due process. Show us the conspiracy, Ambassador Kryll. Present your evidence to this council. Kryll could not, because there was no evidence beyond association with humans, and admitting that would be admitting that the Vordaxians feared the mere presence of witnesses. On Kelthera, the arrests backfired in precisely the way Commander Zethric had not anticipated. Instead of frightening Keltherans away from the humans, it drew them closer. The humans had stood in the street. They had watched. They had recorded. They had not looked away. Mira Theln, who had been wary of Marcus Cole, came to his door that evening. "You stood in the street," she said. "When they took Dren." "Yes." "Why? You could have been arrested also." Marcus looked at this elderly woman who had spent years learning to make herself small and invisible. "Because someone needed to see. And someone needed to show others what happened. That is why we are here, Mira. Not to fight for you, but to stand with you. To make sure that when they do these things, the whole galaxy is watching." Tears formed in Myra's large eyes. "We have been alone for so long. You are not alone anymore." The pattern repeated across Kelthera. Humans inserted themselves into daily life, becoming part of the fabric of communities. They taught in the evenings after work shifts ended. They shared meals and stories. They documented every abuse, every violation, every moment of cruelty. Marcus began teaching groups of Keltheran workers about equipment maintenance in a way that emphasized safety over speed. "You see," he would explain, "if you check every coupling before starting the machine, it might take an extra 10 minutes. But it prevents accidents. It is simply good practice." He never suggested they should slow down production. He simply taught best practices that happened to take more time. Amara's educational programs grew. She taught not just children but adults who had been denied learning for years. She taught literacy, mathematics, history, and critical thinking. She taught them to question and analyze, skills that were applicable far beyond the classroom. Other humans contributed in their own ways. Thomas Wright worked with Kelthran farmers, teaching ancient Earth agricultural techniques that were less efficient than industrial farming but more sustainable and gave workers more control over their own production. Artists created murals celebrating Kelthran culture, reminding people of what they had been before the occupation. Medics provided free health screenings, documenting the toll of industrial work on bodies never evolved for such labor. The Vordaxian authorities found themselves trapped. Every action they took to suppress the humans was documented and broadcast. Every arrest became evidence. Every use of force became a scandal. They could not remove the humans without admitting the humans were a threat, and admitting the humans were a threat meant admitting what they threatened, the secrecy that allowed oppression to flourish. Commander Zethric called for reinforcements. His superiors denied the request. Reinforcements would draw attention, would suggest loss of control, would prompt the Galactic Council to send observers. He was told to manage the situation quietly, to restore order without creating incidents. It was an impossible task. Order had been maintained through fear and isolation. The humans had broken the isolation. They had shown the Kelthrans that they were not forgotten, that their suffering was visible, that someone cared enough to simply be present. 3 months after the humans arrived, the first large-scale work stoppage occurred. It began at a processing facility where conditions were particularly harsh. Workers simply did not show up for the morning shift. They gathered instead in a nearby square where Amara Johnson had been conducting literacy classes. They did not riot. They did not attack anything. They simply sat down and refused to move. Vordaxian security forces surrounded them. Commander Zethric arrived personally, his patience exhausted. Disperse immediately, he ordered. Return to work or face arrest. The Kelthrans looked at each other, then at the humans scattered throughout the crowd. Marcus Cole sat among them. So did Amara. So did hundreds of others. The workers found courage in that presence. We request safe working conditions, one worker called out. We request the right to rest periods as guaranteed under Galactic Labor Convention 73. We request the return of our educational facilities. These are legal requests. You have no right to make demands, Zethric snarled. Actually, Marcus said, standing up slowly with his hands visible and empty, they do. Galactic Labor Convention 73 applies to all workers on member worlds, including those under administrative occupation. I have a copy of the convention right here, if you would like to review it. Zethric wanted to strike him. Wanted to arrest every human in the square. Wanted to disperse the crowd with force. But he knew that every action was being recorded. That footage would reach the Galactic Council within hours. That Ambassador Chen was probably already preparing her next presentation. You will disperse, he said finally, his voice tight with controlled rage. We will review your requests through proper channels. How long will that review take? Amara asked, standing beside Marcus. As long as necessary. Then we will wait. Peacefully. Right here. The standoff lasted 3 days. The Kelthrans sat in the square, refusing to work or leave. The humans sat with them, documenting everything. Other workers from other facilities joined them. The crowd grew from hundreds to thousands. They sang songs from Kelthran tradition. They shared food. They taught each other and learned from each other and remembered what community felt like. On the 3rd day, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session. The images from Kelthra had become impossible to ignore. Thousands of civilians engaged in peaceful protest, surrounded by heavily armed security forces. The contrast was stark, the oppressed asking for basic rights, the occupiers threatening violence. Ambassador Chen presented the council with a simple question. We sent civilians to engage in cultural exchange. They have broken no laws. They have used no violence. They have simply been present, have borne witness, have stood with people asking for rights guaranteed under your own conventions. If you demand their removal, you admit that watching is a threat. You admit that testimony is dangerous. You admit that the Vordaxian occupation cannot withstand the light of day. High Arbiter Telmon, who had dismissed Earth's concerns mere months ago, now faced a reality that could not be ignored. Ambassador Kryll, he said, turning to the Vordaxian representative. The Council requires explanation. Why do thousands of Keltheran civilians sit in protest? Why are basic labor conventions not being observed? Why does the presence of human civilians threaten your administration? Kryll had no good answers. He spoke of security concerns and economic necessity and cultural differences, but his words rang hollow against the images displayed before the Council. The vote came swiftly. The Galactic Council authorized the deployment of international observers to Kelthera. They mandated immediate implementation of labor protections. They required the establishment of an independent review process for Keltheran governance. The Vordaxian occupation could continue only under strict oversight and with respect for the rights of the occupied population. It was not liberation, not yet. But it was transformation. The Keltherans had found their voice, amplified by human presence. They had learned that bearing witness had power, that documentation was a weapon, that simply refusing to accept injustice could force change. On the day the first Galactic Council observers arrived, Marcus Cole stood with Mira Theln in the square where the protest had begun. The crowd had dispersed, workers returning to facilities where conditions were already beginning to improve. International pressure worked wonders for safety standards. You came as tourists, Mira said, a smile playing at her lips. That is what your document said. That is what we are, Marcus replied. Very interested, very involved, very inconvenient tourists. Mira laughed, a sound of genuine joy that had been rare on Kelthera for too long. Your people have a strange way of traveling. We have a strange way of doing many things. But we have learned something over our history, that sometimes the most powerful action is simply refusing to turn away. The Vordaxians thought they could do whatever they wished because no one was watching. They were wrong. Young Kelm, Myra's grandson, ran up to them with a tablet in his hands. Amara had given it to him, loaded with educational programs and stories. He was learning to read now, learning to code, learning to dream beyond the factory floors. Marcus, he said excitedly, I made a story. Do you want to see? Marcus knelt down to the child's level. I would love to see it. As Kelm proudly displayed his creation, Marcus caught Myra's eye. She nodded once, a gesture of gratitude that encompassed everything, the humans who had come, the courage they had inspired, the future that was now possible. Ambassador Chen watched from Unity Station as the transformation of Kelthera continued. The 10,000 tourists would stay for another 6 months, helping to establish the frameworks for genuine self-governance. Some would stay longer. Some would return home with stories that would inspire others. The non-interference treaty remained in place. Earth had not violated it. They had simply found the space between military action and inaction, the place where civilian courage could achieve what armies could not. Chen composed her report to the Human Council, summarizing the Kelthera initiative. She concluded with a paragraph that she suspected would be quoted for generations. We have learned that war is not the only form of intervention. Presence is intervention. Testimony is intervention. Teaching and documenting and simply refusing to look away are all forms of intervention. The treaty banned military force. It said nothing about human witness. Perhaps it should have. But now it is too late, because we have shown the galaxy a new way to fight tyranny, by flooding it with people who care enough to watch and brave enough to stand beside those who suffer. She sent the report and looked out at the stars, at the countless worlds where injustice still flourished in shadow. She smiled. There were a lot of shadows out there. And humanity had 10 billion potential tourists. The message was clear, dictators of the galaxy, regulate your weapons all you want. You cannot regulate our stubborn refusal to mind our own business.